I hope you all enjoyed your lunch, and since your stomachs will be a bit busy now, we will take care of your brain, and we will take you to a special, a bit different place. Now with us in New York is Mr. John Cohn, IBM Fellow, but most of all, a mad scientist, a nerd, as he likes to call himself, and a tech wizard. And he will take us into the future. We were talking today about the future in terms of investments and growth, but now we will think about what the technological development will bring to us and how it will change our lives and businesses. So, let's make this call to the future and see if we can reach this future. Mr. John Cohn, are you with us?
I am. Thank you, Petra. Dobar den, everybody. Hope you're enjoying the IBM Business Bridge, and I'm very pleased to be joining you here from beautiful New York. I'm here to talk about meeting the future, but let me tell you quickly a little bit about myself, okay? So, are we seeing the charts?
Yes, we will see them in a minute.
Yeah. Good?
Yes, you can go.
Okay, good. So you might ask why you're asking somebody who looks like the past to tell you about the future. And it's because I really am a nerd. I mean, I've been doing nerdy things. If you can look at my picture again, can you switch back? So
we see.
I have been a nerd forever. I knew I wanted to be an engineer when I was 8 years old. I grew up near the space program in Houston, moved to Vermont, and I've been in IBM for almost 34 years, just a little more than 34 years now that I think of it. But the main thing that I wanted to tell you about is I want to talk about personal and business reinvention and how we rebuild the future. So not only have I been here 34 years, but I want to introduce you to someone else. Are we back on the charts?
Yes.
Yeah. This is Gabe Mariano, my father-in-law. He passed away last year, but after 36 years with IBM. And he worked on very big pieces of equipment for building chips. This was old technology, the kind of stuff that I grew up on. This is the ceramics used to make chips. He built those things, and in the course of his actual career, we saw great changes where the technology that he started on no longer existed by the time he ended. So he built these big machines, but the best thing that he built was my beautiful wife, Diane, who was also an IBMer. You have to know you are at a good company when the company issues you a wife, a good wife. So Diane also was at IBM for 8 years. Now she's a yoga teacher. But between us, we have 78 years with IBM. And through that time, we have been able to see so much change and reinvention. And meeting the future is about reinventing. It's about constantly reinventing yourself. Let me tell you a little bit about the company. A couple of years ago, our company turned 100 years old. And I'm not here to tell you a lot about IBM, but I think this was interesting because I had to do some homework. When you turn 100, it's a big deal. I had to give a bunch of talks about being in a company that was 100 years old. There was a picture of me because I was the oldest and weirdest looking person at my IBM site. There's a picture of me in the newspaper, and underneath it, it said 100 years. And it made it sound like I was 100 years. But I saw the governor, and he said, "You don't even look like you're 90. But the point is, 100 years of history. Do any of you know much about IBM? Do you know what IBM initially made? We made time clocks and sausage grinders for making sausage because they were business machines. Then we started making tabulating machines for punch cards. Then we started making computing machines. We didn't want to call them computers because people were computers, and we didn't want to compete with people. But we made this large computer during the Second World War, and it used vacuum tubes and motors. It was so loud you had to plug your ears when you walked near it. In 1964, we invented and I keep using the word we, but you could substitute almost any big computing company. We created an idea, a system idea, the System 360, which was a business innovation. It was a technical innovation, sure, but the big business innovation was that we were going to keep the architecture constant. So if someone bought it in 1964, the software they wrote would still work in 1974, 1984, 2004, 2014. Code that ran on that machine in 1964 will still run on our machines. Business innovation. We invented the IBM PC, and it's an interesting story. We invented it, but the industry took it over. So sometimes just reinventing yourself is not sufficient, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But we had to almost, at the time we had to create these small computers, it was predicted to be the end of big computers, yet we had to continue to reinvent ourselves. Then e-business, the idea of business being done on the web, completely changed the way things were putting together. And we had to retool again. And again, the industry started to outpace us, and we almost had to catch up. And here we are now in an era, which I'll talk about, called cognitive computing, with like our Watson machines, where computers are starting to interact with us in a different way. They're starting to learn. Each one of these steps is a fundamental rethinking of what you did. And I want to take that step one further, because as we meet the future, you really have to think about how that future is going, how you're going to make that future. So this chart is actually not from our company. This is a chart from Ray Kurzweil and Hans Marevik, where they were looking for, do you know the Terminator? You know this movie?
Yes,
so
I do.
Skynet is the computer that out here in time will eventually take over the world. Well, they were trying to figure out when computers might actually be comparable to humans in thinking. So what they did, they went back 100 years and they looked at how much computing you could buy for a certain amount of money, adjusted for inflation. So going back from 1900 up to about about to the present. And each one of these dots is a real computer. And if I look, they're not all IBM, it's across the industry. And if I look at the progression, again, from the first types of computers that were mechanical, electromechanical, vacuum tube, discrete transistors, which is where I joined, integrated circuits, it's an interesting story. It looks like it's Moore's law. It keeps growing. But what's interesting more is this. It looks like it's a nice smooth curve, but it's really not. Innovation doesn't work like that. It only works like that in history when you look at the past. What it is it's a set of very discrete straight lines where everything's working smoothly, and then it's punctuated by these big disruptions where something that used to work in the past no longer works in the future. And these periods are very, very hard. Like when I joined in the early 80s, we were transitioning from bipolar transistors in our computers to CMOS transistors. One thing you'll see is that sometimes in those disruptions, you actually have to take a step backwards. More importantly, though, you have to be very cautious, because when those disruptions come, new companies come up and old companies die. Many companies can't make those transitions. The future that you make belongs to the people who understand these disruptions and can jump through them and move through them and take the leap, because it's so convenient to think about doing what I did before better. If I just turn the crank one more time, it'll be okay. If you do that one too many times, you get in trouble. So it's how we deal with these disruptions and how we act on them. I mean, continuous innovation, the straight parts are really good. I mean, if you look back, I grew up in Houston, where the space program was in the United States. And it was really, I spent all my time wanting to be an astronaut. And it turns out I don't look good enough to be an astronaut. You have to be more handsome. But if you think about the compute power that was landed on the moon, and you look at how much compute it was, like 2K of RAM, 16-bit words, et cetera, these small things, and you compare it to like the average smartphone. I mean, the average smartphone is a supercomputer compared to what put men on the planet. So that is a testament to steady progress. At the same time, that's about in 45 years, that's 62 million times more memory, just in something that you can now put in your pocket. But if you're not careful and you get stuck in this one way of looking at things, of just turning the crank, how many of you, if you follow airplane history, in the early part of the 20th century, the Wright brothers and a group in Russia invented manned flight. For the longest time, up until the 1940s, how fast an airplane was the biggest deal. And if you just plotted that next point on the curve, you would be fine. Notice where the Concorde is. How many of you have been on a Concorde? Anyone in the room? Raise your hand. You really have? Is it cool? It's probably pretty cool. But the point is, unless you're Mick Jagger or that guy, you know, it's not worth the extra money. You know, it's easier to watch 2 movies than 1.5 movies. So what happened is they, at great expense, they built they just followed the curve up, but the game had changed. It was no longer how fast, but how cheaply you could carry people across. To make that a little bit more real, how many of you read The Economist? Yeah, I try to read it. I always read it in the bathtub and I drop it in the water. Does that happen to you? But they did a study on the same thing about continuous versus disruption. There's this thing that you use to cut the beard of your hair, of your face, called a razor, which I know of, I've seen them, but I don't know how to use one, obviously. But in 1900, Gillette created one of these things and had a great business model. It was, you know, give you the handle and then you pay for the blades. And that worked very well until about 1998. One of their competitors came up with the idea, if one blade was good, 2 blades would be better, okay? So they invented the Track 2. So let's go back to the chart a little bit, okay? So then a couple of years later, when Gillette said, well, if 2 is good and that seems to be making progress, let's go with 3. And they created the Mach 3. Then their competitor said, well, 3 is good. 4, they created the Quattro. And believe it or not, in about 2006, somebody invented the Fusion, which had 5 blades. So the Economist said, well, if this progresses the same, we will have 14. So the point is, but I do want to say that just last week, someone sent me a Kickstarter for a laser-powered razor. Isn't that pretty cool? Can you imagine? The point being that you cannot just look at the past to predict the future. Now, I mentioned that these disruptions, these periods of disruption, are very, very important. And they're very painful sometimes, because when you have to reinvent, sometimes you have to do it in a very disruptive way to yourself. In our company, many businesses that we were in, businesses that my father-in-law was in, businesses that I were in, we have matured and become commodities, and our company has had to let go of them. It's very hard. It's very disruptive. I remember in 1998 when we sold the typewriter company, my mother called and said, oh, John, your company is going down. You know, that's the only thing that that's the best thing that IBM has ever built. I'm sorry, you must have picked the wrong company. You know, it's such a weird thing, though. As progression goes on, you have to remix your business. You have to remix your thinking, because remixing that has enabled us, if you go back to the chart, to remix those money and those skills. We've reinvested about $42 billion of that and made 150 acquisitions to continue to reinvent our business. And I would argue that's what it takes if you want to make the future, much less meet the future. Now, I do want to say is just because something is old doesn't mean it's time to get rid of it. If that were true, I wouldn't be here. But what's really interesting, if you look at the IBM mainframe, if you remember, you're all very young, I can tell. But when you think back to the 90s, people were saying, oh, the mainframe is dead. You know, long live the personal computer. And we were trying to figure out, well, what does the mainframe mean in this, as from the 1990s? Well, what we ended up doing is we've reinvented that thing 2 or 3 times, and now it is the best, highest virtualized, highest utilization, lowest power, most space and cost efficient Linux cluster in the world. And that same business that was almost extinct in the mid-90s is now one of the fastest growing segments of the Unix business. And it's in our, it's growing at about a 30% compound annual growth rate. It's completely reinvented. It's not the same old stuff, but it's the same technology thinking applied in a different business context. Again, reinventing yourself. Now, when we talk about reinvention, we're at the cusp of something incredibly interesting from my standpoint as a nerd. And I think as your standpoint, if you're thinking about how technology is going to affect business going forward, when we think about the early days of computing, they were just doing mechanical calculations. Just basically a big calculator, replacing people with slide rules, okay? The last 4 to 5 decades has been a very, something that we've taken for granted. It's that you program a computer, and it's programmable systems. Somebody writes a program, it takes a bunch of inputs, and it can figure out what to do in the future, with the data, and give you some analysis that you can then act on. We've taken that for granted. Everyone in this room, myself, we're raised on that. But we're on the cusp of a very interesting change, and that is the notion of cognitive computing, where computing, the combination of the new hardware and new software, starts to take in data in a very different way and learn like you or I do. So it's rather than, telling it, understanding the problem and telling the computer exactly what to do and then looking at the results and then changing the program, having software and hardware that can learn about the problems and reason on itself. It sounds like science fiction, but if you actually go back a couple of years, it was actually, first announced, it's been in the works for more than 10 years, but in 2011, IBM I worked on this computer called Watson. And it was a combination of very big hardware and very interesting software that was around computer learning. In this country, we have a video game called, we have a video game called, a TV show game called Jeopardy, which is the hardest thing. My life wish would be to be on this show because they ask you everything. They ask you science questions, politic questions, fashion questions, everything. But it's a very difficult, they're not specifically asking the question. The question is like a riddle. You have to answer it with a question. Very, very complicated. Well, a couple of years before 2011, we decided if a computer could learn all those facts and figure out how to decode these complicated clues, we could do something amazing with it. And what we did is in Valentine's Day of 2011, we actually pitted this computer against the world champions in this game, and we won. And we weren't sure we were going to win. It was one of these things the day before. We didn't know whether we were going to look like idiots on TV or it was going to be great. Well, it went very well, but that was kind of an interesting starting gambit. What we've done with that since 2011 is we've been using the same learning technology and applying it to all forms, business, security, cooking. We actually have, but the most interesting thing for me right now is we're using it for medical diagnosis. Like at MD Anderson Hospital in Houston, where my brother works near there, that we're actually using Watson to read all of the medical literature. Now, you'll never put a knife in its hands, well, at least not anytime soon, but it is helping doctors diagnose cancer. And it's, even trained doctors are finding help in this thing. It's been applied to sales. It's been applied to security. And I mentioned cooking. I'm here at the Learning Center in IBM Armonk. There are 2 recipes that are on the menu here in the room service that were designed by this thinking computer. It is going to change the world because it is going to become cheap enough to be able to embed in everyday things very quickly. Now, one of the things, if you go back to the charts, one of the things that's very interesting about this era is that as you start to learn, you have a huge explosion in data. We're at an unprecedented amount of data expansion, whereas right now, in any any 2 days, we create more data than has existed in all of time before. There's an interesting statistic that right now, 2015, approximately, we have about as much data out there in bytes as there are stars in the galaxy, not the galaxy, in the known universe. And it's coming from a variety of sources, enterprise data, which is our traditional stuff, but things like social media and sensors and devices, Internet of Things, the stuff that I work on. I mean, for example, if you are flying from London to Heathrow, an Airbus 380 collects about 680 terabytes of data in that 3.5-hour flight. 680 terabytes. Now, right now, we're just beginning to look at that data. Most of that data gets collected and then thrown away. The reason that this data expansion is happening is because the more data you have, the more data you build. You contextualize it, it gets really huge. Now, I like lots of data because it takes a long time to collect that. It takes a lot of space to store it. One of the things that I'm so excited about with my company is that we are in the business of pure technology too. A couple of years ago, I was at our Almaden Research Lab, and one of my friends, who was part of the Nobel Prize winning team for atomic force microscopy, I know that's a mouthful, but it was the technology that allowed people to see atoms and move atoms that before 1998 was not possible. So he showed me technology that with 12 atoms of iron, just 12 atoms, think of how small that is, you can store a byte of data. So of course, they wrote the company motto, think. But I also know they wrote a bunch of bad words because why not? But they also have some fun. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. I'm not going to show it right now, but they actually have been using atoms. This picture right now was a Valentine's Day card they made out of just atoms, moving atoms around on a piece of copper. Now, I'm about to change gears a little bit, but I want to tell you a story. The reason I was in the laboratory is because I wanted to do this. This is my middle son, Sam's name in 33 carbon monoxide molecules on a piece of copper 10 nanometers across. I mean, 1/1,000,000th of a human hair. I was there to do it. If you can come back to the picture of me for a second. I was there because my middle son, I have 3 beautiful boys. My middle son, Sam, died in a car accident walking across the street in 2006. And it was such a hard thing. So one of the things that we do is we make these little stones called Sam stones. If you look at samstones.org, you can see about it. Because we want to talk about, my son was an organ donor. And we spend a lot of time talking about organ donation. And it's a thing that, I don't know in your country, but if you can talk to your family about your wishes, it makes all the difference. But these stones, we've had a lot of, I can't say it any other way, fun in his memory, passing these stones out, hiding them all over the world, making them out of chocolate, glass, and even atoms. Which brings me to an interesting point. If you go back to the charts, do you remember this chart? You remember this? This was the continuous versus disruptive? Well, that's true in technology. I would say it's also true in our own lives. Instead of computing, though, maybe it's how much fun you have, how much money you make, how much responsibility, 1 over the amount of hair you have. But each of us is going to have a period like this, whether it's our individual path or it's going to be our businesses, the businesses we create and recreate. In my life, it's been about going to school. Should I go to MIT? Should I move to Vermont? How many kids should I have? I didn't have to think about a wife because IBM issued me a wife. Should I get a tattoo of my company in a place I can't show people? Which I did, but hey, I love the place. But sometimes, like with my son, things happen that you can't control, and you have to figure out how you're going to do it. It's just like that. There are periods of continuity, and then there's periods of disruption. Again, it's like that with our businesses. And again, it's how fast, how you approach those disruptions. Are you scared? Do you try to avoid them? Try to put your head in the sand, keep doing what you used to do? Or do you dive through them? Because those disruptions are what really make us successful and allow us not to meet the future, but to invent the future. This picture of me at the end, if I have time, I'll tell you a funny story about some disruption that I hit head on. But the point is, you need to think about this and think about how you move through those disruptions, because that's what defines the future. I've learned a few lessons about that. And I mean, they aren't technical lessons. It's not like this technology is going to be important. Yes, Internet of Things is going to be important. Yes, cognitive computing is going to be important. More importantly, it's going to be the way we invent and the way we create ourselves. The first thing that I would say is I have learned that innovation often comes between existing places. So if you keep looking at the topic that if you, for example, just look at banking, you'll understand the past very well and you can incrementally increase. But if you look at the intersection of things like between banking and social networking, those betweens are unexplored. Those are much more of a greenfield and much more innovation. In my own case, I had 30 years of making chips for IBM. And as IBM transitioned a little bit on how we were making chips, I ended up becoming a software guy in Internet of Things. And Internet of Things, like this, are big deal. And it actually allows me to use some of my past skills, but I've had to redevelop it. So the big thing is to pay attention. That means don't just talk to the people who you work with on a day-to-day basis. Talk to people in alternate fields. Talk to your kids. Your kids are often going to be the more tuned in to what's coming, and being able to apply what you know as a more mature person to the trends that they see. That's great business. Back to the charts for a second. The other thing that I've learned, and that I always have to remind myself, is to be fearless. Because at these disruptive points, and we are at a disruptive point as things are moving to the cloud aggressively, et cetera, you need to be able to dive in rather than stand back. I'm a shy person, I really am, and I tend to be very fearful. My youngest son, Gabe, I was stressing out about something at work. It was actually about giving a talk. Not like this. This kind of talk is stressful, but I had to talk at his high school, and I was like really freaking out. He made me go and jump off this bridge 15 meters because he knew that if I could face that, I could face the talk. And you know what? I'd like to say as I jumped off of this bridge, everything became clear to me. That's not really true, but I do know that when I was jumping down, going back was not one of my options. So that was a kind of a good vote. So the idea is to jump into it, and don't worry if you have to make a couple of mistakes. So go back to the charts. You'll see one of my favorite people. Do you know who that is? That smiley guy? That is T.J. Watson Sr., our fearless leader, who over 100 years ago invented IBM. He's not a very funny-looking guy, but he said some cool things. You know what I said about making a few mistakes? He said something really good. He said, if you want to increase your success rate, double your failure rate. Well, I think that's a pretty interesting thing. I brought that up in a department meeting a couple of weeks ago, and my boss said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I told her, our founder said it. But it's true. If you become so risk averse, so scared to move forward, you're just not going to do it. It's better to jump off that bridge if you have sort of know which direction the water is in, and then correct, than to sit there fearfully and wait for other people to figure it out, because they will invent the future if you're not there. The other thing that Mr. Watson said, which I think is really great, and one of the real secrets, I think, of staying innovative and being part of that future wave, is if you are not playing well, he used to say, the game isn't that much fun. And when that happens, I tell myself to go out and play when I was a kid. What he means is not like you should go out and play football or fish or, have fun with your family. You should definitely do that. That's work-life balance. What he was saying is bring play into your innovative spirit. What that means is that you're not spending all your time worrying about the outcome. You're not worrying about who's watching. You're not worrying about making mistakes. You're exploring. You're lost in it. You're willing to try a few things and discard them if need be. So that notion of play, when I look at my most senior technical peers, the other 80 some odd IBM fellows, most of them have maintained a playful approach to their inventive spirit. And I would say, as we collectively with AmCham, together reinvent. I mean, I've noticed that Slovenia is I think it's number 24 or number 28 out of 144 countries in the pace of innovation. That is an admirable record. And I mean, what I know of Slovenia, I love it. My first time there was 30 years ago. My most recent time was just a couple of years ago. You've reinvented yourself many, many times. And I see no country that has a better sense of play. Mountains, oceans, great food. So I think you've got this one down. Another lesson that I learned is to be open. And one thing that I know that is happening in Slovenia is sometimes we get so closed in with our ideas that we don't want to share. We're living in a great time to be an inventor because instead of having to invent everything ourselves, the new domain, whether you call it the maker movement for physical things, open source software, things like Code for America or Apache, crowdsourcing like Kickstarter, or open data, where Slovenia is actually, I think a role model in the world. Be open to using stuff that other people have done, but more importantly, contribute your stuff with the thought that people will build on it. Now, just very quickly, I want to tell you a funny experience that I had, and I recognize I'm at about a half an hour, but I'll only be about 3 more minutes, okay? Petra, is that okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, so occasionally, though, you have to really wipe the slate clean and try to think of something different. About a few years ago, I got asked if I wanted to be on a reality TV show. Do you guys have reality TV? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But I had never seen reality TV. But I got asked, do I want to be a scientist on reality TV? So I ended up spending 2.5 months in a warehouse living with a bunch of crazy people trying to recreate society. We ended up building crazy things, eating. We spent a lot of time just trying to survive. I've been a vegetarian for 30 years, but I ended up eating rats to stay alive. And you know what? They're pretty good. With basil, they're really good. But we ended up, it was about inventing. It was about trying to innovate yourself out of a problem. And again, I learned some very powerful lessons on that. And you can go find this show. It's pretty stupid. It's called The Colony, and you can find it streaming. I think it was dubbed into Slovenian, by the way. But there were a couple of lessons. You remember I just mentioned about being open? When you're on TV and you've got all these cameras on you, everybody was trying to make sure that they had their idea. I had this revelation that at one point I was trying to do a task. I was trying to turn a car over, if you can show the picture. I was trying to turn that car over to take the alternator out to be able to make a piece of generating equipment. And it was going to take me half a day to do it. One of the other guys just called me a bad name and said, let's collaborate. He basically called everybody together and we flipped the car over in 5 minutes. And the insight from that is I kind of went into this experience thinking that asking for help was a sign of weakness. And what I realized is asking for help, whether it's personal help, business help, innovation help, is a sign of sanity. More importantly, because in this open spirit, it only works if you give back, that if you're in position to give help, if you're in position to mentor a junior employee, mentor a startup company, mentor your kids, that is a blessing, and you should do that. Finally, can I just get the last picture? This is a weird picture, but one of the things that I recognize about all of this notion of meeting the future, reinventing the future, there's a lot of worry that goes into, am I going to get it right? Will I be successful, etc. And we worry so much that we write the future in our minds. We say, if I'm not getting this right, my business will not succeed. If my business don't succeed, my kids don't get to go to the right school. If my kids don't get to the right school, I'll end up living in a ditch in Ljubljana or whatever. You just write this whole future. And it's just in your mind, right? It's never that bad. You should never, that is the biggest impediment to inventing the future, is trying to picture it. Exactly, because it's going to be different. This story, if you go back to this picture for a second, on this TV show, we were very dirty. We were living in a warehouse. We were sleeping in 10 people in 2 beds without much water to wash. One day, it started raining. And it only rained 3 times while we were there in 59 days. As all of my companions went out to gather water because we needed it to drink, I ran out the back door, took off my clothes just to try to get the dirt off of me. As soon as I turned around, there was a guy with a camera looking at me. And I went, nah, you wouldn't do that. And he goes, I would pick up that piece of plastic. Well, I didn't think about that until I went back to work, back at IBM. The TV show had not come on. I got asked to come down to Armonk, our headquarters, to talk to our communications lead, the most senior guy in communication in IBM. He was asking, tell me about this show. So we talked about it for a while, and he was pretty excited. So when I was driving home, I called one of the guys in the meeting. I said, I was a little worried because a reality show had lots of bad words, beep, beep. He said, don't worry about it, as long as you kept your clothes on. Well, 2 weeks later, I am in a room with about as many people as you are there, and this is the last 45 seconds of the first show. Luckily, this is after I picked up the plastic. I was thinking, oh my God, my kids are seeing this. My parents are seeing this. My boss is seeing this. I thought my career was over. I thought I was going to get fired from IBM. You know what? My career's only gotten better. When I saw that big boss guy from IBM, his only comment was, dude, you should get more sun. So the point is, you don't have to worry so much. So with that, let me just recap and say the future is ours to create. We're going to create multiple futures. We're going to get some of it wrong, and some of that's going to be really exciting to get wrong. If you approach it, you jump into those chasms where things are changing. You do not become fearful. You look for bringing in different points of view. You're not fearful. You share what you know. You use what other people know, and you do it with a playful spirit. We are going to invent that future together. And I really look forward to coming to Slovenia and working with you to reinvent that future.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, and I must say we had really much fun with you here in Ljubljana. But now I would also like to open the floor for some questions. We have time for 2 questions. Anyone?
Hi, my name is David Berger. I'm from the American Embassy here in Ljubljana, and we partnered, of course, with AmCham for this business bridge. I'm going to ask the question that probably some people in here are ashamed to ask. Can you explain to a simple bureaucrat what the Internet of Things is?
I am, David. I am a simple bureaucrat. At a technical level, it is being able to connect objects like a car up to some sort of centralized computing in order to do analytics. So let me say that's the technical answer. But what I would like to say, and I'll give you an example of what that means in a second. But what I like to do, I like to quote David Rose and talk about making enchanted objects. With the ability to put very simple computing and very cheap computing in anything, the combination of that with ubiquitous connectivity, cellular connectivity or other connectivity, and almost infinite computing resource that's becoming smarter and able to reason on its own, it's like you can put infinite intelligence in everyday objects, whether they're toys or cars. Now, how does that really pan out in your real life? All of us have had this experience. You're driving in your car, and there's a light that comes on that says, maybe it's a small wrench. It says, fix your car. What does that mean? Do you need to drive it immediately to the dealer? Do you need to step away from the car because it's going to explode? Or can you handle this, 6 months later when you have your service? Well, right now, every car knows the answer. They just don't know how to tell you. So more and more, about 10% of cars now have this connectivity. In the next 2 years, almost 100% will. But they will be beaming that information back to a host computer, which will be analyzing it. It will tell you not only what has happened, but more importantly, it will be able to prevent it in the sense that it will predict by reading things like, the vacuum pressure is going down, and your oxygen sensor is clogged, you can say, oh, you've got an oil leak. And not only can I then, communicate with you by email or text message and say, you really ought to, we'll help you schedule that service, but I can anticipate it before it's going to be more expensive, and I can pre-order the part so you don't have to say, well, the part will be in next week. So that's a very simple kind of use case. So it's basically connecting objects up so that the shared knowledge of what those things are telling us can be used to analyze and prevent problems before they happen. Did that work?
Thank you, John. Did it work? Yes.
Hello, Tomasz Schweiger, Top Potential of 2015. How real is Skynet? Is this a possibility we should be afraid of, eager of, or how can you comment on that if you started with Terminator?
I am an optimist, Tomasz. I am very much of an optimist. I don't think that we will have I don't foresee anything like Skynet happening. What I do worry about is, maintaining enough sense of privacy, et cetera, where computers, I don't worry about them, making us into pods and putting, cables into our back. What I do worry about them is becoming so intrusive that they know more about us than we would like. So I think like any technology, nuclear technology or anything, it's something that can be used for good or can be used for evil. Evil is a strong word. But I think that there's enough oversight on how computing is evolving that I don't foresee it getting away from us. But I do foresee a time where it will be very difficult to tell whether there's a human presence or a compute presence at the end. Now, whether that is really intelligence or not is more maybe a philosophical or theological question. But I am an optimist. I think that we will make some mistakes, but they will not get so out of hand. The more worrisome things is that when you start to I worry a little bit about privacy and being able to put that genie back in the bottle. But that's a much less, that's a much more solvable problem. So I would consider myself an optimist.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for being with us today.
It was really fun.
Yeah, it was fun for us as well, believe us. And I must say that tomorrow we will also touch upon the topic of Internet of Things and digital transformation. So we will hear more about that and what the IT corporations are preparing in that field. And now we will have a short break, 10 minutes, and then we will start with the next panel. So thank you so much, John, and hope to see you soon in Slovenia.
Thank you, guys. Dobar den.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of the day.